We can talk about curses all we want, but right now, we're about to cross into the Twilight Zone. In 1983, Steven Spielberg and John Landis decided they wanted to adapt a classic TV series into a movie. To do this, they wanted to make an anthology film, so they gathered some of the best 70s and 80s directors that were there. And we should remember that directing back then and in the 70s and 80s was pretty punk rock. The reason a lot of these directors came to prominence was because they were breaking certain cinematic conventions, because they were kind of rebels in a certain way. But unfortunately, one of the ways that kind of comes across can always be a lack of professionalism and outrageous conduct. And that sort of style made them fantastic directors, but also it could often lead to a set being rather dangerous, which was the case with the Twilight Zone. They were true auteurs of cinema, for better and for worse. So the directors they got involved were, of course, Spielberg, George Miller, Joe Dante, and notably for the discussion, John Landis. John Landis was seen as a slightly reckless director before in the production of the film. For the basis of his discussion on the curse, we're only really going to discuss the only element that anyone ever discusses in the mention of the Twilight Zone being cursed, because aside from this, there's not much else to say, and that is the unfortunate Twilight Zone helicopter deaths. They were shooting a scene that was incredibly complex. It involved Vic Morrow running under a helicopter while explosions were set off, carrying two children. Essentially, the story of this segment was that his character was racist, and because of Twilight Zone shenanigans, he kind of sees what it's like with the shoe on the other foot. He witnesses what it's like to be discriminated against and has a change of heart by the end of the film. So in this segment, he was meant to carry two Vietnamese children to safety during a moment where he's being attacked by American troops because he's now seen as the enemy. Filming with children on sets can be rather tricky. You can't keep them too late at night, and that was the case with the Twilight Zone. They couldn't film with kids, but they wanted a legitimate night scene, and that led to problems. And because of that, they basically took a 7-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl from the street that didn't have any work permits to film these scenes. It was one of many instances where labour laws were broken on the set of the Twilight Zone. In fact, after the unfortunate accident that we'll get to, many of the child labour laws on film sets would be radically changed. Landis didn't even seek a special waiver because if he got that, he might have been able to film late, but he was worried because the scene involved explosions and a helicopter that he wouldn't get that permission, so he did not seek out that waiver. He also paid the children under the table so he could get around these laws. Parents were also not even made aware of what the scene involved at first. They weren't told about helicopters, they weren't told about explosions, but they were told that it would be safe once they found out. And once they heard of this, the casting director actually voiced their concerns, but those concerns fell on deaf ears. And other people on set didn't even show that level of concern. They lied to some people that the children were in the scene, and they actually at one point hid the children from a welfare officer. The scene was a very physically demanding one, something that Vic Morrow was actually aware of. He basically voiced his concern before filming. He said, "Why am I doing this? I should get my double to do this." And even in rehearsal, it seemed that it was very physically demanding, and the parents of the kid were again told this was not a dangerous scene. And when you see the footage, which unfortunately there is footage of this accident out there, it was played all over the news and would be for years while this court case was eventually figured out, it's clear to see that he's struggling. Now, when they tested this without actors in helicopter, the helicopter was actually rocked by explosions, and according to the pilot, it was alleged that Landis said at one point, "You ain't seen nothing yet," indicating that he was probably going to be even more violent with explosions for the actual scene. It was the final day of shooting and the final scene. The helicopter is in flight and Vic and the kids are running through water. The helicopter is above their head, and the helicopter is hit by a mortar effect. And while there's some argument about the placement of the helicopter, it leads to the rotor on the tail of the plane to fail, and the helicopter to fall. And as Vic Morrow tries to retrieve one of the dropped kids from the water, the helicopter's blade decapitates him and one of the kids. And the other kid is crushed by the weight of the helicopter. If there's any solace to be taken from any of this, it's said that their death was instantaneous. There's been long disagreements about whose fault this is, from whether the effect that caused the failure occurred too early. Landis insisted, apparently, that the helicopter fly lower, which he was told already was unsafe, and that if he did so, they might lose the helicopter. But parents insist, in the court case that followed, that he asked that the helicopter lower, and as a result, perhaps he is to blame. But he insists it wasn't entirely his fault, and he will be eventually acquitted of manslaughter. Regardless of the reasoning, the helicopter was too near the explosion. And what would follow would be a decade of litigation and changes to laws to make filming safer, and for the families of those involved to finally get some sort of justice. This is an incredibly upsetting thing, and a lot of people point to it as a curse because it's so horrible. But it's the only instance where we could really point to something going wrong on the set of the Twilight Zone. Of course, unfortunately, it was go drastically wrong. But if we come to the question of, is there an explanation or does it need an exorcism? There is an explanation for this, as sad as it is. It's open and shut. There's nothing else about the film that could have even contributed to the idea of a curse. It's just a totally avoidable tragedy. In fact, Spielberg and Landis were good friends, and Spielberg essentially said after this that it forced him to grow up. He wasn't friends with Landis anymore after this. He said that there's no reason that someone should die for any film. No film is worth someone's death. And if you ask me, this just stems from negligence and disregard for safety. And I honestly feel like Landis should have seen jail time for this, and he possibly isn't the only one. There's a grim explanation for this, and because of that, I have to say there's probably not a curse film in the Twilight Zone.